Okay, so welcome to the lecture for week 5. The actual topic of the lecture is about parental care, but I wanted to start by following up on a little bit more material about sex and mating that we didn't have time to get to last week. First of all, I just want to show you the display of this bird called the Hubara buster that lives in North Africa. I think it's my new favorite courtship display. So, female Hubara bustards prefer males who do these displays. This is how they're choosing their mates, apparently. But here's the really interesting thing: understanding these displays can be important for conservation biology. These Hubara bustards are endangered, and people are trying to replenish the wild populations by breeding them in captivity. And what a research group showed was that with these captive birds, when females see more displays, so you've got a graph here with each dot is here the females who saw more male courtship displays were actually better able to rear their offspring in captivity. So the artificial fertilization process was more likely to be successful, and the eggs were more likely to hatch surviving chicks. So that's really incredible. It shows that social evolution can be very important. Okay, so just following up on some of the definitions and material that we didn't get to last time. In animals and in humans too, the terminology on the slide can be used to define different kinds of mating systems. And mating systems can be defined both in terms of the observable pairing behavior of the individuals, but also in terms of the genetics. And sometimes the observable pairing behavior does not match up with the genetic partnerships and kind of who are the parents of which offspring. And so there's 4 kind of major classes, but of course in reality mating systems are really a continuum. And we have everything from monogamy, where one female partners with one male, to polygyny, where multiple females partner with a single male, and polyandry, where multiple males partner with a single female, and then polygynandry or promiscuity, when both of the sexes are mating with multiple mates. And of course, within a single species, you can have different populations that differ in these mating systems. And that's true within humans as well. So let's look a little bit at some more data from our lineage, the primates. So the primate species show a huge range of differences in mating behavior, and also these different mating systems have consequences for our morphological evolution. In a species where multiple males can mate with a single female, that leads to post-copulatory competition for who's going to be, which male is going to be successful at fertilizing her offspring. And so this is an example of a rhesus macaque with very well-endowed testes. And this graph shows you the variation, the huge variation in testes size with respect to body size across primates. And humans are on there as well. So the black line is kind of like the average scaling relationship between testes size and body size. And you can see that there's some primates like chimpanzees that have like really big testes given their body size. And then there's others like owl monkeys that have very small testes given their body size. So in chimpanzees, for example, the testes are 3 times bigger than orangutans and 4 times bigger than gorillas, even though male gorillas are 4 times bigger than chimpanzees. And if humans had the same testes size scale to our body size as chimpanzees, that would be like a human male having 2-pound testes. So what it turns out, and you can see on this graph, is that the species where the testes size are disproportionately large for their body size are the ones that have more promiscuous mating systems, where multiple males mate with the same female. And so it's an example of how the mating system has this direct consequence on the evolution of our morphology. Okay, so humans were shown on this graph, sorry, I'll bring it up again, as having a polygynous mating system. And is that really true? Well, if you go on Wikipedia, you can look up the list of people with the most children, and the ones that have the really big numbers are, of course, all male. There's males with like hundreds of children listed on here. There's not that many, but it's certainly possible to happen. And many human cultures are thought to have been polygynous. But in actual fact, mating systems and sexual behavior have varied a lot across human populations. And in this paper that came out a few years ago, they were plotting this graph where each data point is a different human population, a different kind of traditional human society. And what I want you to focus on is the y-axis. The y-axis shows the percent of married men that had more than one wife. So having more than one wife would be polygyny. But these traditional human societies ranged a lot, from several that were completely monogamous. They had a y-axis value of 0 on this graph, to some that were highly polygynous, where a lot of the men had more than one wife. Even within a polygynous society, the extent of polygyny varies quite a lot, because unless there are way more women than men, not every man could have more than one wife. So human behavior is quite variable. And this leads to variation among individuals in reproductive success, and that can be looked at as another indicator of the strength of sexual selection. The more variance among individuals within a sex in terms of their success, the greater the sexual selection. And so this graph is a bar graph that plots the variance in reproductive success. So how variable are individuals and how many offspring they have across a number of different traditional and modern human societies, but also the top 2 sets of bars on each of these plots is showing you data from 2 primate species, 2 non-human primates, macaques and mandrills. And what I want you to take from this again is that there's a lot of variation across the human societies in this metric, these metrics of sexual selection, whether we look at the maximum number of offspring that a single person has or the variance in the population and reproductive success. There's some human populations with high variance, some with very low, and none of them are reaching the kind of extremes that are observed in the non-human primates. And we even have human societies where polyandry occurs. Although rare, polyandry is thought to have occurred in about 2 to 3% of traditional human societies. And it's often associated with places where environmental resources were very scarce. Okay, so that wraps up the content I wanted to cover on sex and mating, and we can get into today's lecture on parental investment and care. And some organisms go to amazing lengths for their offspring. And I want to start with this example. It's about a 2-minute video.
For this smaller species, a better option is to retreat underground. So he digs himself a tunnel down into the mud. His heap of spoil is an indication of the extent of his excavations. With the tide flooding the tunnel twice a day, maintenance is a real burden. The tunnel is more than a refuge from the sun. It serves another very important purpose. The tunnel is actually U-shaped, and at the far end is a sealed chamber, the walls of which are lined with eggs. The eggs are kept in air as it's richer in oxygen than the water. The problem is the air that's trapped here won't last for long. So the male travels to the open end of the tunnel to gulp fresh air. Back he goes down his tunnel, where he releases it into the egg chamber, replenishing the oxygen on which the eggs depend. He will repeat this hundreds and hundreds of times until his young hatch. This lifestyle is very demanding, yet the mudskipper has found a way around every problem.
So I just find that so incredible. These male mudskipper fish are bringing oxygen down deep into these burrows where their offspring are developing. It's just incredible to me that that could evolve. Of course, there's lots of other examples of organisms where most of the parental care is done by dad. This slide shows some photographs of giant water bugs. They're some of the world's largest insects. They're so big they can even prey on frogs and fish. And they take male parental care to the extreme. In these giant water bugs, the females lay their eggs directly on the male's back, and the male takes full responsibility for caring for them. He spends hours near the water surface to keep the eggs aerated and protects them until they can hatch. So we can think about some interesting questions here. First of all, why does this species do so much parental care? There are many other insects that do virtually no care. The mother will lay the eggs on a substrate somewhere and leave. So what is it that requires parental care to evolve? And second, why is it males and not females doing the caring in this species? So this is an outline for the lecture material that we're going to cover. We'll start by just setting up some definitions in terms of parental investment and parental care. And then we'll get into these two evolutionary questions that I just hinted at. And we'll look at examples that use cost, benefit, and optimality models to consider parental investment decisions. And we'll look at how game theory can be used as a framework for understanding whether mom or dad is the one to provide most care. Okay, so starting off, what is parental investment? Well, we can define it as resources that are invested into gametes and or offspring that increase the chance that those offspring will survive and reproduce at a cost to the ability of the parent to invest in itself, its own survival, and or its future offspring. So parental investment comes from investment in gametes plus investment in care behaviors. And so gametic investment is just resources that you invest in producing your gametes, your energy and materials that go into creating those gamete cells. And parental care involves behaviors that increase the chance of offspring survival, so caring behaviors. And keep in mind that a parent is often limited in the amount that they can provide. And this limitation creates these conflicts or decisions that parents are faced with. If you're a parent, should you allocate to your current brood, or should you reserve your energy, your resources for future offspring? Also, should you allocate to this individual in your current brood versus this other one? Something that anybody with siblings will probably be familiar with. Okay, so we can think about different types of parental investment and kind of timeframes where it can happen. Before birth or hatching, we can think about investment in things like building the nest, building the burrow, defending the place where the offspring are going to be reared, caring for the eggs inside the parent's body, providing food or nutrition to the eggs or the offspring before birth or hatching again, but also after birth or hatching, again, defense of the territory where the offspring are being reared, feeding, protecting the offspring after birth and hatching. And often parents continue to care and defend for offspring even after the offspring are nutritionally independent, which means they no longer require the parents to be there for food. And I just have a couple of video clips here to illustrate the diversity of forms these care behaviors can take. And these all involve birds. So this first one is the Australian brush turkey. And this is a time lapse from somebody's backyard. This species of bird is a part of this lineage called the megapodes, and they're this very ancient lineage, and a lot about their behavior is thought to be similar to some of the earliest birds. They build these huge nests on the ground. It's the male who builds the nest, and that's what you're seeing here. The nests are made up of leaves and decomposing earth, and they can be several meters high and several meters across. It's just this great big mound of decomposing stuff. And the male works tirelessly to maintain his mound and kind of stir it up and make sure it's just right. And what happens is the females come and lay their eggs in the mound. And rather than being incubated by the warmth of their bodies, the eggs get incubated by the heat of decomposition from this mound. It's this really incredible system. All right. Okay, the second example I have is the pin-tailed sand grouse. These are relatives of pigeons, and they live in these dry desert environments. And they do something really incredible. So there's no narration to this video. So they live in these super dry places, and they don't necessarily nest where the water is located. So to be able to satisfy the thirst of the newly hatched chicks, the males travel to water, and they dip their breast feathers in the water, and their breast feathers are specially designed to soak up and hold water. And then they fly back, sometimes miles back to where their nest is, and they breastfeed the water to their chicks from their feathers. It's a very incredible behavior. It's just remarkable to me that this has evolved. And the males will fly back and forth miles and miles, many times a day, doing this to rear those chicks. Okay, the third example I want to show you comes with a warning. This video shows the darker side of care. Nature is not always so beautiful. This video is a little bit disturbing. I just want to warn you in case you prefer to skip it. These birds are Nazca boobies, and this footage was taken in the Galapagos Islands. And there's a chick on the left here, and then two parents. And what you're going to see,
maybe that's one of the ones with the mark,
is the parents being aggressive towards this chick. They've pushed it out of the nest, and they're abusing it. And so why? Why would they do that? How could this evolve? Well, it's terrifying to look at, but sometimes these darker behaviors are an adaptive response to an allocation decision that the parents have to make. And I promise in a few slides later, I'll show you something cute that will make up for this. Okay, so now that we've seen these examples, what explains the extent of care provided? Why do some parents care and others reject or desert their offspring? Well, to address this question, it's helpful to think about the potential costs and benefits and try to come up with optimality models for what the best decision could be under different situations. So there's always a trade-off between investing in your current offspring and versus your future offspring. So the possible benefits of caring could be increasing the chance that your offspring will hatch, or increasing their growth rate, increasing their ability to survive and not be eaten by a predator. The potential costs are your own energy, your own time, increased predation risk to yourself, and the decreased probability that you'll be able to breed again in the future. So these are the kinds of factors influencing the evolution of the decision-making strategies that parents are using. When we look at that example of the boobies, I'm not going to show you the data, but boobies lay 2 eggs. These Nazca boobies always lay 2 eggs, but usually the environment is only rich enough for the parents to rear 1 offspring. However, sometimes there's a really good year and they can successfully rear 2. And so our best hypothesis is that laying 2 eggs gives them the possibility of that bonus chick, but most years, if they tried to rear both chicks, probably neither chick would survive. And so the adaptive decision for the parents is in kind of a regular year when the environment is not so great to choose to rear the stronger of the 2 chicks and reject the others. And so that's called conditional infanticide. Okay, so I want to show you an example of the diversity of parental allocation decisions in birds. And this study comes from the observation that across many bird species, a lot of the birds that live in the tropics tend to be long-lived, and they tend to have relatively few offspring with each breeding event. So in each year, they might have a much smaller clutch, but they might live for many years. Whereas many temperate bird species tend to live for much fewer years, but have much larger clutches of offspring every year. And so this slide just shows you 2 examples. The wire-tailed manakin that lives in the Amazon rainforest is a small bird. They weigh about 13 grams, and yet they can live for 10 or 15 years. And every year, a female will lay usually 1 or 2 eggs. Whereas we have species like the black-capped chickadee that we're all seeing around here in Ottawa that is the same body size as the wire-tailed manakin, yet it usually only lives 2 or 3 years, and a female will lay between 6 to 10 eggs each breeding season. So tremendous variation in life history strategies. Well, this leads to some predictions about how they should allocate their parental care. Can you anticipate what those would be? Well, so it's just summarizing what I mentioned on the previous slide. Well, this difference in their life history sets up a difference in the value of current versus future offspring. So if we just think about costs and benefits, in the species that live for a long time and have a high probability of breeding again, parents should be very concerned about their own safety and survival because they have a high chance of breeding again and again and again in the future. However, in these short-lived temperate species, parents should be very much more concerned with the value of their current offspring because the probability that they're going to survive to breed again is much lower. So the value of the current brood is much higher for these short-lived temperate species. So these graphs show you a graphical representation of the prediction, but also some real data on the variation in clutch size and survival probability across a large number of bird species. And the white data points in panel B here are the South American species, and then the black data points are the North American species, including things like the black-capped chickadee, right, that have large clutch size but low survival probability in any one year. And so the prediction shown up on top is that these tropical species should be motivated to minimize risk to themselves, whereas the temperate species should be motivated to minimize risk to their offspring. Okay, so the authors of this study, Gallenbohr and Martin, tested this with an experiment about 20 years ago, and they did a really ingenious thing. They found nests in all kinds of different places in North and South America, all different bird species, and they found these nests and they presented a predator at the nest. And they tested 2 kinds of predators. They tested jay predators that would be a danger to offspring, but that wouldn't be big enough to predate the parent. And they tested predators that were much larger, like hawks, that would be a danger both or primarily to the parents and wouldn't be so interested in the eggs. And what they found is depicted in these bar graphs here. The bar graphs show the average feeding rate of the parents at the nest before and after the predator presentation. And then we've got like the 2 different kind of biomes represented. We've got the short-lived species in red and the long-lived species in blue. And then we've got the 2 different types of predator presentations represented in the 2 plots. So I'll just talk through what they found. So they found that the parents from the short-lived species in red responded most strongly to the predator that was dangerous to the offspring. And that's exactly what we would have predicted, right? So if we look at the red bars, for a strong response, we're looking for a big change in how often the parents visit the nest. And that's because when there's a predator around, the last thing you want to do is show that predator exactly where your nest is. So the red bars had a pretty strong response to both predator presentations, right? When the predator was an offspring danger, they decreased their feeding rate. When the predator was a danger to themselves, they decreased their feeding rate, but they had a slightly bigger decrease in their feeding rate when the predator was a danger to their offspring. However, we see something different in the blue bars, these long-lived tropical species. When the predator was a danger to their offspring, they didn't change their behavior much. They continued at a fairly high rate to feed those offspring. However, when the predator was a danger to themselves, that's when they had a much stronger response. They really decreased their feeding rate when the predator was a kind of a self-danger. So it fits our kind of optimality predictions of how parents should be allocating these different risks. Just as a quick aside on optimality models, remember, these optimality models don't always provide a full picture of natural systems. There's a lot of costs and benefits that aren't necessarily accounted for in any one model because no one model can be as complex as reality. And organisms aren't always optimal. So think of concepts like Homo economicus and the rock, paper, scissors imitation paper. Just because a behavior is optimal in a given environment doesn't mean that that's the behavior the organisms will do, because the behaviors that organisms have, the kind of mechanisms that we have evolved to meet a bunch of different demands. So they might not be optimal for any one situation. However, the kind of optimality cost-benefit approach is still useful because these tools let us understand how an optimal, or they let us kind of predict how an optimally behaving animal would act under certain circumstances. And when organisms differ from the predicted optimum, we can start to ask why, and we can look for what's missing from our initial hypothesis, and then we can formulate new hypotheses to explain the discrepancy. So that's where the value of these optimality models is. The other thing is the modeling process forces us to be very careful about defining our assumptions and defining the costs and benefits involved. So optimality models are often a starting point for understanding behavioral evolution that can be used to develop our hypotheses and guide our future empirical studies. Okay, so coming back to this idea that parents have to make these decisions, they also have to often make allocation decisions among siblings. So if you have a current brood, should you care equally for all of them? Should you favor certain individuals in your brood? So we see this very frequently when an animal species has multiple offspring in a single brood. For example, in barn swallows, they'll often have clutches of 5 or more chicks in a nest, and the chicks are begging to be fed. So who should get fed? If you're a parent bringing food back to the nest, which individual chick should you feed, and should you distribute those feedings equally among everybody, or should you prefer certain of your offspring? Well, what researchers have found is that when the chicks are giving these like really conspicuous begging signals, opening up their gapes are very colorful and red colored. And the coloration of these gapes is an indication of how healthy the chicks are. The healthiest chicks have the reddest, most vibrantly colored gapes. And what they did in this experiment was they tested whether the coloration of the gape altered the parents' willingness to feed one chick over another. And so they used food coloring, red and yellow food coloring, and then water as a control. And they just put a few drops into the chick's gape. And so some chicks were kind of given red food coloring to enhance the redness of their gape. Some were given yellow to create a yellower gape, and some were just given water, which wouldn't alter the coloration of their gape. And what they found was that looking at the before-after bars on this graph, that the parents increased their feeding rates for the reddest colored chicks the most. So manipulating that gape color to make it redder also made it so the parents fed that redder chick more often. So in barn swallows, parents are using this signal of health to allocate their feedings towards the healthiest, most robust young in their brood. Something similar goes on in other bird species as well. The American coot is a water bird that lives in Western North America, Western Canada. And like barn swallows, they have this bright reddish orange coloration, although instead of being inside their mouth, the baby coots have this bright red orange coloration on their heads. They have these like funky little bare heads with some orange feathers around. And it may be a signal of how healthy and robust the chicks are in the species as well. So in this study, they did something really complicated, and I'll try to explain it here. They manipulated the coloration of entire broods, and they created broods that either had, where the chicks all had the same coloration, or where the chicks were heterogeneous. So in the control groups, the control broods, all of the siblings within a brood would be given the same color. Either the chicks were kept as orange, or their orange feathers were trimmed off, and their orange was reduced to black. And so they would take, the control broods would either be like a whole bunch of orange chicks or a whole bunch of black-headed chicks. In the experimental broods, the researchers would take a single brood and then make it like half orange, half black, so that there would be variation in chick color within a brood in the experimental group. Okay, and so what they found, this is the data here. So we've got graphs of the results for the control broods where all the siblings look the same on the left, and on the right we've got the graphs for the experimental group where the siblings were heterogeneous. And the y-axes are showing you how often the parents fed these chicks per day and how much the chicks grew per day. And what they found was that in the homogeneous broods, it really didn't matter whether the brood was manipulated to be all orange or all black. The parents fed them at the same rate on average, and the chicks grew about just as well on average. However, when the researchers created these heterogeneous broods where some siblings were more colorful than others, that's where they saw the real discrepancy. It was the orange-headed siblings that were getting fed the most and that grew the best. So parents in coots are paying attention, again, to relative condition within the brood. Okay, so usually care is provided by biological parents. And there's a lot of evidence that genetic relatedness matters and influences parental care decisions. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that on this slide. And they take a little bit to explain. So bluegill sunfish, we've seen videos of them before. They live in lakes here in Ontario. And the males are the ones that care for the nest. They defend the eggs from potential predators. And that's how they provide care. But they also have this very polygynous mating system where a female can be, her eggs can be fertilized by more than one male. And so the eggs in a given nest might not all be the owner's offspring, like the male owner of that nest. They might not all be his offspring, depending on whether another male was able to fertilize that female as well. Okay, so in this experiment, the researchers wanted to test whether the nest-owning male's perception of his paternity or his certainty of his paternity would influence his parental care behavior. Because we would expect that if many of those eggs are not his own, he should allocate less to them. And so what they did was they did an experiment where they would expose the male who was owning the nest to potential rival males who might fertilize the eggs as well. So the control males were not exposed to rivals, and then the experimental males had other potential rival males coming in during the time of egg laying. And then they measured how often the males protected their eggs from potential egg predators. And so if you notice the bars in blue, you can see that in the control group where the nest-owning male was not exposed to rivals, he was much more willing to defend his nest from predators than in the experimental group where the nest-owning male was exposed to those rivals. Okay, another example that comes from baboons. The young baboons in a troop often fight with each other and sometimes injure each other. And the adult males in the group will cradle and protect offspring and kind of nurse them when they're hurt. And what this graph shows is from a given group, there's 15 different males plotted along the x-axis. So each bar represents a different individual. And it shows how often they like cradled and provided help to their own genetic offspring versus somebody else's offspring in the group. And almost all of the males 1 through 12, are on the positive side of the y-axis there. And so that means that they provided more help, more care to their own offspring than somebody else's offspring. And there were just a handful of males, 13, 14, 15 there, that provided more help to non-offspring. However, sometimes care is provided by non-parents. And I think this is my favorite example of this ever. This video is, again, about 2 minutes long. Okay, so that's an example of help being provided by an individual that's not just unrelated, it's an entirely different species. And that's not the only case where things like that happen. For example, in ring-billed gulls, parents often end up adopting a chick that belongs to a different pair of parents. It's not the most common thing, but it does happen often enough to observe. And researchers have found that these adopted chicks are more likely to survive than they would be had they not been adopted by their new set of parents. And often the adoption happens because their original parents haven't been able to collect enough food to support that offspring. Okay, so what about the parents? Why should they do this? It's not increasing their own fitness to care for somebody else's offspring, at least not immediately. So what could be going on? Well, if we think about kind of cost-benefit models, we have to think about what is the cost of being really stringent about rejecting offspring versus the cost of accepting and providing care for more individuals. So the parent gulls could be stricter in their discrimination system, much like the coots, but in a busy colony where everything's really chaotic and it's often hard to identify your own chicks, maybe being too discriminating could have the devastating cost of occasionally rejecting your own chick. And so perhaps these ring-billed gulls have evolved a willingness to feed any chicks that beg persistently at them, because the cost of the occasional acceptance of a stranger is less on average than the cost of the increased rejection rate that would happen if they were too conservative. So it's probably true because adoption is pretty rare. It only happens to about 10% of the gull parents in a given colony in a year. Now, in some species, individuals also provide care to their extended family members. And one example, like humans, is an amazing example of that, of course. But one other example is from elephants. So elephants have these matriarchal societies, and they live for a very long time. And a lot of care is provided by grandmothers. And in fact, researchers have found that having a grandmother nearby in the colony can enhance calf survival in Asian elephants. And this is some data from that study. And so this is a survival curve, something similar to what we saw in the paper we read about ants. So we've got survival on the y-axis, where 1 is probability of survival. So 1 means like survived, and the lowest level on this y-axis is 0.6, which means like 60% of individuals survive to that age. And on the x-axis, we've got different ages of the elephant calves. And the different lines and colors and symbols here represent categories of kind of the chick's family environment. So did they have an older mother or a younger mother, and was their grandmother nearby, or was their grandmother somewhere else in a different troop? And so the black line is the worst one to be in for a chick. That was the class of chicks that had the least probability of surviving. And that was the group that had a young mother and did not have a grandmother in the same group. Whereas survival was high for all of the calves that either had an older mother or had a grandmother nearby. So it seems that in elephants, having grandma nearby is especially helpful for younger mothers who might not have the expertise needed to be able to help that calf survive. And these data show how the grandmother's presence also helps the mother to produce more offspring. So when grandmothers were nearby, the interbirth interval, or the average number of years between births by the mother, which is like the grandmother's daughter, was smaller. So the mothers are able to be like produce more offspring, have higher fitness when their own mothers are nearby to help. Okay, so what could explain this? Well, we're going to look more at this in the lecture next week, but it relates to a very important concept of inclusive fitness. And as background, fitness in an evolutionary sense can be defined for individuals, for phenotypes, or for genotypes. And fitness just refers to an individual's reproductive success. It's measured by the individual's contribution in terms of offspring to the next generation. Inclusive fitness expands on that traditional definition to account for the fact that genetic variation is shared among a group of kin. The individuals that share your genetic variation are not only your direct descendants, but also your descendants that are kind of related to you through other means, like, for example, your nieces or nephews. And so inclusive fitness can be calculated based on your number of offspring equivalents, and that's calculated using genetic relatedness, and these are concepts that we'll look at a little bit more next week. Another way to say this is that your inclusive fitness includes copies of your genes passed on through kin that are not your direct descendants, not necessarily your own children. So we can talk about the inclusive fitness of an individual, but we can also talk about inclusive fitness of a gene. And so a gene or allele that has high inclusive fitness is one that promotes its own success in future generations. And this concept of inclusive fitness can explain the benefits of providing care for extended family members. All right, so we'll touch more on that next week. The other big question I want to cover in this lecture today is who should provide the most care? Should it be mom or dad? And we'll look at how game theory can be used to analyze the conflict between the sexes over offspring care. So just some terminology. There are 4 major types of parental care systems. We have species that have no parental care, species that have maternal care only, species that have paternal care only, and then species that have biparental care. And these different parental care systems are often linked to mating systems. For example, in birds, lek-based mating systems, which are polygynous mating systems of things like the Houbara bustard, they're associated with female-only maternal care. Okay, let's look at a few different examples from the animal kingdom. So under the category of no parental care, that's common in a lot of organisms that do broadcast spawning. So these are often external fertilizers that just release their gametes into the environment, and they often live in aquatic habitats. So a lot of invertebrates and some types of fish have no parental care and have this kind of broadcast spawning mating system. And they often have like extremely promiscuous mating systems. Maternal care only is where females are much more likely to provide care. And this is really common in mammals that have prolonged internal gestation of the offspring, and where the female is the one that provides milk. And so that constrains the kind of opportunities for that requirement for internal gestation and milk production constrains the ability to abandon young and have them survive. So most mammals also exhibit polygynous mating systems in association with this parental care system. And just to shout out to the lekking birds, they also have female-only care. Okay, paternal-only care. This is really common in fish. So many bony fishes have paternal-only care. Usually externally fertilizing and territorial fish species. And the male often does activities like constructing the nest, guarding it, fanning and aerating the eggs, just like the mud skippers that we saw. And the fish that exhibit these paternal care only systems have a great diversity of mating systems. Now, I will say that it's not only fish that do paternal care only. We saw things like the giant water bug, and there are also some birds where males provide most of the parental care. And the last category is biparental care. This is where offspring survival requires the care of both parents simultaneously. It's most common in birds. It's also the system that we humans have, and it's often associated with social monogamy as the mating system. And so there's some fish like these convict cichlids in Costa Rica that do biparental care, the barn swallow that we've seen already, where both the male and female take care of the offspring. And then we have some data on this slide from another bird species that lives here in Ontario, the dark-eyed junco, which has mainly biparental care, but sometimes the male abandons the nest and the only one parent cares for the offspring. And so that variation in parental care provides an opportunity to look at how well are these parents able to rear offspring as just a single parent versus a pair. And what the data show is that we've got these survival curves, right, plotted against age of the nestlings, is that when only one parent remained at the nest, the survival of the nestlings really plummeted. Whereas when two parents are feeding the offspring, you can see it's still a tough world out there. Most baby juncos don't survive and fledge. However, they're much more likely to survive when both parents are caring for them. So there's really a need for biparental care. Okay, so this chart is from a textbook that summarizes the kind of predominant care systems in the major animal groups. However, I would say like humans are an example where male-only care is provided. So I think that there are some exceptions to some of what they put in this table. But the main point here is that within any one of these taxa, there are evolutionary shifts in the type of parental care that's being provided across lineages through time. And these evolutionary shifts are an opportunity to test explanations for the evolution of parental care. And so this is an example of the diversity of care systems in bony fishes. So this flow chart kind of maps out the distribution of different care systems across the teleost or bony fishes that have been studied to date. There are many, many thousands of fish species, but on this slide we've summarized from about 480 of them. And so the ancestral state in teleost fishes was most likely no parental care, broadcast spawning with no care at all. But paternal care likely evolved first because it's the most commonly one seen. So the kind of most parsimonious explanation is that it evolved first. And it's usually associated with the use of a specific nesting territory. And so territory defense likely led to the evolution of paternal care. But in some lineages, they've evolved, fish species have evolved internal fertilization, and that often leads to the evolution of female-only care. And so there's a real diversity happening in fish. And then, of course, we have these other role reverse species where actually the male, like in seahorses and pipefishes, where the male actually carries the embryos. I just wanted to highlight from the news a couple weeks ago that there's still so much to learn about what goes on in the ocean. This is a discovery made in the Antarctic, in the Weddell Sea, a colony of these ice fish, a breeding colony of ice fish, like twice the size of the city of Paris. It was 92 square miles of just these ice fish nests, nest after nest after nest. No one expected that would exist in Antarctica. Just a remarkable density of these parents rearing their offspring. And so the floor of the ocean is something that we only know like small bits and pieces of. There's so much out there that we haven't seen, and probably many other cases like this of remarkable breeding behaviors that are happening in the ocean. Okay, so what about this game theoretic framework? We can think of parental care as a game between a male and female player. And this game is what leads to the evolution of the different parental care systems that we defined a couple slides ago. So each parent has to make a decision, either stay and care for offspring, or desert, leave, and do not provide care. And remember, there are costs and benefits involved. So staying and caring for your current offspring is going to happen at a cost to your future reproductive opportunities. So each parent should be tempted to desert, and that leads to this conflict between the sexes. and we can apply a game theoretic framework to model these strategies. So here's the general idea. We can model the options available to the female, the options available to the male, and these options map on to these different parental care systems. Now, unlike the previous games we looked at, like the hawk-dove game, these parental care games are asymmetric games. And what that means is that the costs and benefits are going to differ for the male and the female player. In fact, these parental care games are almost certainly always asymmetric. And I'm going to show you what I mean by symmetric versus asymmetric in this next couple of slides. So far we've just looked at symmetric games in our previous lectures. In a symmetric game, the payoffs for like the different strategies available to player 1 are exactly the same as the payoffs available to player 2. And so in a symmetric game, you could change the identities of the players and the payoff matrix would still be the same, right? And so you can look for these kind of interchangeable features to tell if a game is symmetric. So when they're both playing strategy A, the payoff should be the same. When they're both playing strategy B, the payoffs should be exactly the same. And when the two players are playing different strategies, when one plays A and one plays B, we should have this kind of mirror image of payoffs, just like we see here. So that's what defines a perfectly symmetric game. An asymmetric game is just one that breaks that symmetry. So let's look at the next slide, a couple of practice examples. For each of these games, are they symmetric or asymmetric? So you should be able to look at the payoff matrix and answer that question. Okay, so if you've written down your guess, the answers are the one on the left is symmetric and the game on the right is asymmetric. Now, I think the game on the right is probably a much more realistic example of what these parental care games would be. Okay, another practice question. In each of these two games, again, for each of the sex, for player male and player female, is there an evolutionary stable strategy? And if so, what is it? So is there an ESS for males? Is there an ESS for females? And remember, that would be a strategy that would be like the best for that player to play no matter what, no matter who they were interacting with. That's what the ESS means. Okay, so if we analyze the example on the left, if we look at the male side first, what we see is that no matter what the female is doing, whether the female is playing care or dessert, it is better for the male to care in this example on the left. And because this is a symmetric game, that means that the same conclusion applies to the female in this game. So no matter what the male is playing, it's better for the female to care. And so this is a symmetric game where both male and female have an ESS, which is care. Okay, let's look at the one on the right, the asymmetric game. If we look at the male, payoffs here, no matter what the female is doing, it is better for the male to care again. And remember, this is an asymmetric game, so we can't just assume that that applies to females. We have to analyze it as well. So if we look at the female payoffs and say, okay, what happens to the female if the male is caring? Well, it's better for her to care. And what happens to the female if the male deserts? Well, it's better for her to care. So we can see that actually, again, although this is an asymmetric game, both of the sexes have an ESS, and the ESS for both sexes is to care. Okay, a third example. You should be able to see right away that this is another asymmetric game. And in this game, the best strategy for males depends on what the female is doing. But if you analyze it, the females have an ESS to care. So no matter what the male is doing, it's better for the female to care. So what do you think will be the evolutionary outcome of a model like the one on the lower left here? So think about what your answer to that will be, and in a couple of slides, we'll come back to it. Okay, so where do these payoffs come from? Like, where do those numbers come from? In the examples, I just made them up. But we can really use that framework to analyze parental care evolution, and what do those numbers represent? Well, they're thought to depend on a couple of the costs and benefits that we've touched on before. They'll depend on the physiological costs of bearing the offspring, like being able to produce the energy and kind of protection that the offspring need. Lactation, for example, in mammals, the costs of doing that. The payoffs will also depend on ecological factors that affect the costs and benefits involved in the decision to desert. For example, the operational sex ratio or the adult sex ratio can influence the costs and benefits, because one of the benefits of deserting would be finding another mate and producing more offspring. And the kind of payoff from doing that is going to depend on how many other potential mates there are out there in the population. So it will depend strongly on that adult sex ratio. It may also depend on factors like how rich the environment is in food resources and how likely it is that a parent will survive to breed again in the future. As we saw with the studies on birds, those survival probabilities can influence these costs and benefits. I have just a couple of examples of studies looking at these kinds of effects. This is data from a study on St. Peter's cichlid fish. It's quite a confusing graph, so I'll try to walk you through it. But the whole idea is that this was an experiment done in the lab of these fish that have very flexible parental care. Both the mother and the father, both the male and the female, care for offspring, but they can also desert depending on the circumstances. And so the researchers here wanted to test the hypothesis that the sex ratio of other adults would influence desertion. And so what they did was they had control environments where the parents were not exposed to other adults. And then they had male biased environments where the parents were exposed to an environment with like a whole bunch of other adult males. And then female biased environments where the parents were exposed to an environment with a bunch of adult females. And the light blue bars represent an outcome of the parents continuing to care for the offspring, and the dark blue bars represent an outcome where the parents deserted the offspring. And so in the left, we have the data from the male parents, and in the right, the data from the females. And so the first thing I want you to notice is that in the control condition, where they didn't have like a bunch of other adults around them, both the male and the female almost always provided care. They rarely deserted their offspring. However, the researchers observed higher levels of desertion when there were other adults around. And for the males, what we see is that the dark blue bar really rose a lot higher when there were a lot of other adult females around. So when the opportunity to gain a different mate was high, the male parents were much more likely to desert. And the same thing was found with the female parents. When the adult environment had a lot of other males in it, a lot of potential mates for the female, those females were more likely to desert. We saw like the rise in that dark blue bar under the male biased environment. Okay, here's another example of parental care strategies differing depending on the environment within a single species. This is data from dunnocks. We saw a video from them in the last lecture where the male was trying to prompt the female to eject sperm from a potential other male. So there's a lot of promiscuity in this species, and for a male who's got a female social partner, it would not be advantageous for him to care for offspring that aren't his own. Okay, and so what they looked at in the study, so each of the data points here represents a different male in the study. They looked at variation across these males in how close he was to his female during the egg-laying period versus whether his female was often like out of sight or away from him during egg-laying. So higher values along the x-axis indicate that the male, the focal male, had more exclusive access, knew what was happening with that female all the time. Lower values on the x-axis indicate that the male was not the one primarily with the female during the period of egg laying. And the y variable here is the amount of parental care that male provided. And so what we find is that the more Abdunnock male monitored his female, the closer he was to his female during egg laying, the more parental care he provided to those offspring. Okay, so we're talking about cuckoldry and the phenomenon of parents raising offspring that might not be their own. And a common urban myth is that in humans, that cuckoldry is pretty common and that there's many people raising children that are not their own, like unbeknownst to them. Of course, there's lots of cases of people adopting children and things like that. So really interestingly, the rise of human genomes, kind of commercial human genomics like 23andMe and things like that, has made it possible to analyze, to kind of do population level analyses to figure out how common is extra pair paternity? How common is it that people might be raised by a father who's not their own? And so it's actually pretty low in humans. It's estimated to be maybe 1%. Okay, so coming back to the practice question with this parental care game, this asymmetric game, what do you think the outcome will be? So if we run through the analysis with the arrows, we know the game is asymmetric. We know that the best strategy for a male here depends on what the female is doing. And we know that the best strategy for a female is always to care. So for males, if the female's caring, the male should desert. But if the female deserts, the male should care. So what do you think will happen evolutionarily? Well, we could predict that females will evolve to use the care strategy. It's always the best strategy for the females. But that's going to mean if the environment becomes saturated with caring females, that's going to mean that males will evolve to desert their offspring. Because when females care, it's in the best interest of the males to desert, according to this payoff matrix. So the population will be expected to evolve towards caring females and deserting males. Okay, so that's it for this lecture on parental care. Just a reminder that this Friday, February 11, we have another assignment, another discussion, and the paper is by Smith et al., and it's about how animals transfer wealth and resources within families. And as a reminder, this week we're going back to campus, but you can choose to do one of two things. We're going to treat our Fridays as a hybrid session. You can either come to campus, come to Nickel Building, room 4020, and remember to wear your mask and to check in with CU Screen. And I'll be there on campus. But if you don't want to come to campus, you can just meet on Zoom, the same link as we've been already using. And Jenna will be on Zoom, and I'll check into the Zoom as well at the beginning of class. And so I hope everything will go smoothly, and I look forward to seeing you soon.